I was in awe of my father. He seemed to do everything in such a graceful, effortless way. 1955 was a big year for him. He started his own business, Acro Machine and Tool Company. It was the year he had his 32-foot Seafarer-class wooden sailboat Sisu designed and built. And it was also the year that he became a father for the first and only time. I was his only child, his firstborn daughter, whose birthday was 3 days away from his. His birthday was April the 9th, and mine was April the 12th. Having our birthdays so close always made me feel as if there was a special bond between us. My dad was born in Jälasjärvi, Finland in 1918. He came to Canada with his mother Edla and his sister Ada to meet his father Gerhard, who had been working in a mine in Kirkland Lake, Ontario. Gerhard was tragically killed in a mining accident when my dad was just 9 years old. And my dad, his mom and sister all ended up moving to Toronto. My dad went to Central Tech High School and then apprenticed in machine and tool shops. He became friends with Gus Rieselou and Martin Max, and they eventually started their own company, Acro Machine and Tool Company. My mom first met my dad through her brother Bill. My dad and Uncle Bill were friends who enjoyed having good-natured sparring matches as to who was the better singer, Bing Crosby or Frank Sinatra. Uncle Bill was a die-hard Crosby fan, whereas my dad remained a Sinatra fan all of his life. I never met my maternal grandparents because they passed away long before I was born, but my mom told me that my dad had a warm, congenial relationship with both of them. My grandfather Angus actually shared the same birthday as my dad, and also had an entrepreneurial spirit himself. He owned his own cartage company. It was called Brown Cartage, and he had his own horses and carriages at that time. My grandmother Christina was very fond of my dad and would say things like, "There's no too much wrong with that laddie," in her distinctive Scottish accent. My mom and dad had quite a long but happy courtship. My mom often told me that she was attracted to my dad's adventurous spirit. She insisted she would never have tried to do the things she had done if it wasn't for my dad. She enjoyed going on adventures with him. My parents were married February 17th, 1945. They first lived on Bastido Avenue in the city of Toronto before moving to a farm with an apple orchard in 1952. My dad and my Uncle George had purchased the farm together, and my mom and dad moved there with our extended family. We all lived in the same house, with my Aunt Ada, Uncle George, and Carol in the front part, and my mom, dad, grandmother, and I living at the back part of the house. Eventually, my aunt, uncle, and cousin Carol moved to their own home, and my grandmother moved to the front part of the house. She would often be my designated babysitter. My dad was definitely determined to keep the romance alive between my mom and himself, so he would often call my mom up after work and say things like, "Get your cocktail dress on, Chris, and meet me at the Seaway. Bill Butler's on piano tonight." This would mean an evening of dining and dancing, and my mom would practically be giddy with anticipation. My grandmother would usually click her tongue with disapproval and say things like, "Why don't those two just stay home?" in her distinctive Finnish accent. But then she'd get over it because she enjoyed hanging out with me. We loved watching Lawrence Welk and discussing which Lennon sister we liked the best. My dad often liked to set the tone when he got home from work. I remember when the musical Camelot first opened at the O'Keefe Center in 1960 with Richard Burton, Julie Andrews, and Robert Goulet. My dad couldn't wait to bring home the soundtrack. We listened to it every night after he got home from work. In short, there's simply not a more congenial spot for happily ever aftering than here in Camelot. It gave me chills when my mom told me how President Kennedy had been listening to that very same soundtrack every single night as well. She started calling my dad MJK. As a child, it sounded so close to JFK. And I think my mom enjoyed romanticizing about my dad. I remember how we all discovered how much we loved a certain song by Henry Mancini. It was playing on the radio when the boat was docked in Presqu'île Bay. It was the summer of '62. I remember calling out to my parents, "Mommy, Daddy, what is it? I love it." They both smiled and said, "It's Moon River, Lori." Later, we discovered a certain singer who got a hit record singing Moon River. His name was Andy Williams, and my parents and I watched his television show every week. When my mom learned that Andy Williams and Henry Mancini were performing at Maple Leaf Gardens on my dad's birthday, April the 9th, 1967, she bought tickets for us. And not only that, she did some pretty good sleuthing and discovered which hotel Andy would be staying. It turned out to be the Four Seasons Motor Hotel on Jarvis. And my parents and I ended up in a booth where we were seated side by side right across the room from where Andy was dining. We could even see him seasoning his steak with the oversized pepper shaker at his table, his velvety laughter cascading right across the room towards us. Then he got up, and I practically gasped. He passed our table and gave us one of his winning smiles. It was my father who gave me a little nudge and told me to go after him and ask him for his autograph, which I did after I followed him into the lobby. But face to face with my idol, I could hardly utter a word. I was relieved to be seated back in the dining room with my parents. Andy Williams came back into the dining room once again and acknowledged both of my parents with a nod and another warm smile. My parents responded back in the same manner, and both of them said, "Hello, Mr. Williams," practically in chorus. I was much more proud of the dignified way my parents behaved as opposed to my own silly, awestruck performance. We celebrated our birthdays a couple of days later with my Aunt Ada and Uncle George and shared our story with them. I think we were all still on cloud 9 over our experience at the Four Seasons with Andy Williams and with the concert afterwards with Andy and Henry Mancini. I found it so endearing the way both of my parents could share my childlike enthusiasm about meeting a celebrity that we all admired. 1967 was a special year for us. Not only had we met Andy Williams in person and saw him in concert with Henry Mancini, it was also the year that my dad orchestrated yet another adventure for us. He suggested that we sail our boat on the St. Lawrence River and dock at the marina at Expo 67. My mom and I were thrilled with the idea, and it was one of our favorite trips together. I feel that I have had a charmed childhood, but it didn't have anything to do with having been indulged with material possessions. It was more about the experiences that I often shared with my parents. Sailing with them on the Bay of Quinte and the Thousand Islands, to me, was such a beautiful, exhilarating experience. The 60s were probably our happiest years as a family. Adolescence for me, and I know for a lot of us, wasn't such a smooth transition. And looking back, I realize my parents may have been going through their own midlife crises as well. My dad took charge and decided we should all go away on a skiing trip to Mount Tremblant in the March break of 1969. It felt so good to get away, to breathe that fresh air, have the right balance of exercise and that delicious French-Canadian cuisine. It was at this time that my dad took the opportunity to give me one of his frank pep talks. And when I say frank, I'm actually referring to Frank Sinatra. My dad had always identified with the man and his music. He fervently followed his career from his Harry James years to his Tommy Dorsey days, to his I'm a Fool to Want You Ava Gardner years, to his From Here to Eternity comeback, and even later on after Frank's retirement, his great comeback at Madison Square Gardens. He had, in so many ways, grown up with Frank Sinatra, and I think he found great solace in listening to his music. Mr. Sinatra himself once said, being an 18-carat manic depressive and having lived a life of violent emotional contradictions, I have an acute capacity for sadness as well as elation. Whatever else has been said about me personally is unimportant. When I sing, I believe I'm honest. My dad obviously felt the same way, and for him, listening to Frank Sinatra, it helped to heal so many emotional wounds along the way. So I remember when we were sitting on a chairlift in Mont Tremblant that my dad turned to me, and I could see that he was really concerned about me, recognized that I'd been through a pretty hard time at school, and he, as my father, was going to try to lift up my spirits the best way he knew how. So this is when he turned to me and said, "Whenever you're down, think of Frank singing That's Life. It's always worked for me, honey." Understandably, this might not mean the same thing for those who didn't know my father, but it meant the world to me. I never felt closer to him before. My dad always admired and respected musicians and performers, and somehow felt they were able to express things that he was incapable of expressing himself. But I feel he was so eloquent in his own way. He built things and created things, even invented things, and he made things happen. He took such good care of his family and helped so many people along the way. He gave me such a wonderful life, and I was so proud to have him as my father.
Modern man, gotta make a living, make a plan. Life ain't meant for drifting. Make a plan, make a stand. Modern man, body ba body ba body ba body ba. Foreign man, no smug background, British heritage. Foreign man, you feel you've got your own edge. You always seemed so much larger than life, yet deep so much hurt, so much strife. Yet I still remember the look in your eyes that could still see the world through the eyes of a child.